Hello and welcome to the Sonic Cinema Podcast. My name is Brian Scuttle. Thank you for joining me at www.sonic-cinema.com, as well as the Sonic Cinema Podcast YouTube channel. You can also subscribe, rate, and review at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and pretty much wherever you listen to podcasts. That is the Sonic Cinema Podcast. I hope you check us out, which you likely already are if you're hearing this. You can also check us out at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. There you will get short film blocks. I know I still owe quite a few from Renegade Film Festival, and I will be having some from the Atlanta Film Festival coming up later in the month. That is patreon.com/Sonic Cinema. So over the past few months, you have no doubt seen on Sonic Cinema, if you've been paying attention to us, that I've been doing Blu-ray reviews for certain classic film releases from the boutique label The Film Detective. It's been a lot of fun to not only get into writing about Blu-rays, which is something that I started to do when I started writing about movies in the 2000s, but I kind of got out of. And with The Film Detective, one of the things that's great about it is that it's really introducing me to some movies that I never would have heard of before, and am able to appreciate a lot more now than I would have like when we first got into DVDs. I had a chance to talk to the founder and the president of The Film Detective, Phil Hopkins, who is a well-renowned cinephile. And we talked a little bit about The Film Detective, what goes into film preservation, what it means to be a film collector, and a bunch of other things. And I hope you enjoy that conversation. I'm talking today with Phil Hopkins. He is he is behind a streaming company, Fandor, as well as The Film Detective, which if you've followed me online over the past several months, you'll notice that I've been reviewing several of their releases. And before, I guess the natural place to get started with you is, when did you start to fall in love with movies?
Well, that's a loaded question. At a very early age. So, film in my family was about home movies, right? So back years ago, I had a great uncle that used to film the family members in various events and whatnot. He had a 16 millimeter camera and a 16 millimeter projector. So I have fond memories of being a very young kid, maybe 5, 6 years old, and the family would have movie night where we would actually project films going back to the 20s and all the way up through the late 60s. And what happened in the late 60s was that the format changed for home movies, right? It went from 16 millimeter to 8 millimeter.
Mm-hmm.
And that, the change of technology and the change of film formats changed the way it looked. But I fell in love watching flickering images of my dad as a kid and my grandparents and my aunts and uncles from watching these movies projected on the back of a bed sheet, and having these Saturday night gatherings with 12 or 13 family members looking at the old, what we would call the old pictures. And eventually I became the custodian to that film collection, which were several hundred reels of 16 millimeter film. And I would be the guy that wanted to project them and show them to the family. But at that point, people got kind of tired of seeing them. So it was on me to be creative and find other films to screen. So way back in the early 70s, you could actually get these truncated films and catalogs like the Big Reel, and Blackhawk Films had a catalog. You could actually order these truncated films. So I became kind of an obsessed little kid for acquiring films to show to my family members, and then I would slip in the home movies afterwards, much to their chagrin.
were there any films in particular that kind of sparked your imagination, or was it just the idea of watching films in general and getting to learning to appreciate these films?
Yes. Well, back in the day before you had cable TV and before the advent of the home video market, a lot of early cinema was shown on the local public broadcast affiliates, right? So in Boston, we had WGBH, and that was the public broadcast affiliate that would show a lot of old movies. So I started, really loving old black and white films because of my family's film collection, but also because of PBS. And then regionally, we had a show called The Great Entertainment, and that was a Boston television station that would show the Late Show, and then you had the Late Late Show. You'd have some of the old B movies with Lugosi and Boris Karloff, and so as a kid, I would be up all night with my black and white television set with the rabbit ears, and then waking up exhausted every morning because I'd be up till 2 o'clock in the morning watching this stuff.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the you already touched on it a little bit. What are some of the memories? What were some of your favorite discoveries when it came to once you started to expand your collection, once you started to search out more films as you grew older, what were some of those discoveries that you cherished the most?
Yeah, there's so many. You got to keep in mind. So when I got into film collecting as a kid, there was a long stretch where I didn't do that, right, for a very long time. And then probably in my late 20s, early 30s, when I was approached, there was a fellow that had reached out to me, and he wanted to get into DVD. He knew a film collector that had several hundred 16 millimeter films, and we started a home video company back in the late 90s that would release a lot of public domain movies on DVD. And that was, to me, kind of always finding collectors and finding places that had film elements to improve kind of what we had before. Because when I was younger, we used to go to some of these festivals like Chiller and things like that, and they had VHS, but you would be able to find things that were just unavailable at that time. Mm-hmm. And even getting a low resolution VHS of some of the Lugosi monogram films, you'd spend $20 or $25 just because they were hard to get. They weren't really readily available. And if you think about kind of, for me, reading Famous Monsters of Filmland and being kind of like a classic movie monster fan, I had read about so many films that Lugosi did that weren't kind of Dracula or the the ones that were shown on television often, but the monogram films like Bela Lugosi's Invisible Ghost or the Devil Bat. Getting copies of those was a challenge early on. So you'd get VHS collectors that would sell them at these different shows. And then when DVD came out, the challenge was, how do we actually obtain film prints to improve them? And eventually, how do we get them onto a format that you can actually, then sell them, and you won't be paying a small fortune for, a 16 millimeter version of a film. You can actually get something halfway decent for, like $15 or something like that. So that really was kind of the bridge, I guess, was being a film collector and then figuring out, how we would actually start finding film prints to release in the very nascent side of the DVD market over 20 years ago.
And you started to touch on something that I was going to ask here. What is something about film preservation and film archiving that maybe something that general audiences and even some cinephiles may not necessarily be aware of just how arduous that process is.
It's an obsession. So if you ever see those, TV shows about the hoarders and the lunatics that just acquire things, sometimes there's no rhyme or reason. So an archive has a very succinct, specific goal, which is, the preservation of historic artifacts. A collector doesn't necessarily have that same proposition. They're just collecting stuff because they like it, and they amass many, many things. So when I started meeting film collectors as a young guy, I was astonished at how much stuff was in private collections that wasn't at the Library of Congress or the Academy of Motion Pictures, or more importantly, what the studios actually didn't have access to, that they had just sort of, either not taken care of, or the films as they were originally stored were stored improperly. And in some cases, with nitrate, so much of early cinema was just, combustible and went up in flames. So, kind of the whole idea of tracking down elements and where they were. That's sort of, where we got the impetus to start the Film Detective, was sort of my years of tracking down film elements and working with collectors. And collectors too don't always play nice with other collectors. It's a weird, group of individuals that were hyper kind of paranoid of each other, and they get very precious about it. And you get these sort of little cliquey groups within genre film and different types of film categories that have their own kind of niche experts within them.
When you set out to when you set out to find a film, is it just a matter? Is it something that you've been thinking about this film so much over the years that you just decide that you start to try track it down, or is it just a process of going down lists of movies that you've maybe kept up with that haven't necessarily had distribution over the years, or recent releases over the years that you're interested in releasing yourself?
Yes, so there's the fan side of what I do, where I just selfishly want to see these films presented in a better quality than they were previously. So that's, there's sort of that side of it. And then there's the side which is a little more complicated, where, kind of the rights issues, and then who's sitting on what material, where it is, and then whether or not we would even be able to get access to certain things. So it's twofold. It's me wanting to see things out there, while there's still an audience, right? But also, how do we gain access, and then the relationship we have with the rights owner or the films, sort of where they're stored, being able to be allowed access. So there's the private collectors, and then there's the institutional, where the Library of Congress has, such a vast collection, the Academy of Motion Pictures, UCLA Film and Television Archive, the Eastman House, the British Film Institute, and then the studios. So you have that side of it. Then you have the collectors, who many are getting very old. And in some cases, some of my colleagues, who I was working with 15, 20 years ago, have passed away. And thankfully, we've been able to be the recipients of their collections and maintain them and manage them, and work with, the different labs that we transfer the films and then ultimately get them released. So it's all that stuff, every day that we deal with. And then there's also kind of where, let's say, Turner Classic Movies is looking for a film, where we would be kind of engaged with them to find material, and then work with the institutions to be allowed access to the film to restore it. We just did that recently with Turner for an Anime Wong film that was preserved by UCLA, called The Toll of the Sea, which is a very early Anime Wong film that's airing next month. So it's our collection, it's other collectors, it's the institutional side of it, and then what we're going to actually try to release on Blu-ray or put out onto Turner Classic Movies, or even sub-licensed to another company that's trying to release something. So there's a network. It's a small network of individuals who are fellow archivists and collectors and fans, people who actually appreciate the types of releases we're putting out, which tend to be lesser known films and lesser appreciated, that we try to give historical context to by building new featurettes so we can make them more kind of interesting. I guess, like that's the big thing for us is really when we do put something out, who's still alive that might have been working on the film. We've got a film called The Brain from Planet Arose coming out in June. And we're very fortunate through our relationship with David Schechter, who introduced us to Joyce Meadows, to have her participate in that release. So it's not often we get a cast member who's still alive from a film from 65 years ago. But in the case of Joyce Meadows, she was very much alive and very healthy. So we've recently finished a feature production that she's involved with. So that's great, because it's one thing to have kind of your historical essay for the commentary, but to get a cast member, that's a huge score for us.
Oh yeah, absolutely. When you decide that you want to release something on Blu-ray or DVD, in the case of the Film Detective, how long in advance of, is it a matter of you sort of set the schedule of when you want to try to release them, or is it a matter of when all of the planets align in terms of having the materials, having people interested in helping you bring this context to the film? Is it basically what comes first in terms of the restoration process and the release of some of the releases on the Film Detective?
Well, it's really comes down to the first thing that we identify is, what do we have? What's the material and what's the condition? Because some of the films are in less than perfect condition, even though we might have really good elements to some films. Some of our films have not aged well. So there's sort of a judgment call, and then there's the scarcity of kind of what other material might be out there, and then the likelihood that we would get access to it. So it starts with us sort of going through the collection and saying, okay, we're sitting on, let's say, a 35 millimeter release print of a film versus maybe a camera negative or an interpositive, or we don't have anything except for a 16 millimeter reduction print, and we don't think that we would ever get anything better than that. And then it's really just a judgment call. Once we make that decision, we then send the film to our lab, one of 3 or 4 labs that we work with, and that's when we make a high resolution 2K or 4K film scan. And when that comes back from the lab, we then start realizing, how much additional restoration work and how long it's going to take to complete that. And that could range from a month to 6 months, depending on the level of restoration for the picture, and then ultimately, for the sound design and for the audio. And then once that's done, we start looking at what would we want to include to supplement this. Who would be a good person to do an audio commentary? Who would be a good person to interview for a featurette? And that's where we're really fortunate the past couple of years with working with Daniel Griffith and his Bollywood Productions company. He's just great. He's great at sourcing a lot of this stuff, and the featurettes he's been working on for us have been awesome. So we're very lucky to have, kind of a small group of individuals that help with production. People like Tom Weaver and Daniel Griffith and other people that we've worked with. They're really into finding as many scarce sort of anecdotal stories to include. And then we have kind of the challenge of sourcing either lobby cards or some photographs, and then putting together something that's interesting and contextualizing the film and making it a little more interesting than just sort of putting it on the Blu-ray. What we learned with Blu-ray was, we didn't think that the home video market would go on forever. But the collectors, when we started doing our special editions, we learned a lot. We learned that the mainstream home video market is very different than the collectors, and collectors still want all the extras. They want the liner notes. They want as many bells and whistles as you can put on a disc. So that takes a long time. It doesn't happen, like down and dirty and as quick as people would expect it to. Sometimes a release can take 3 to 6 months to actually get completed from soup to nuts.
Mm-hmm. What is the big? Because in addition to the DVD label, the Film Detective, it's also a streaming channel. What is the big difference for people who may not necessarily be aware between licensing a movie for physical release versus streaming?
So streaming rights are very different because you're ultimately streaming the media over the net. And in some cases, like with our linear channel, we actually have it as a live channel on several platforms. We can watch it like a live TV network. So the app that we have has one experience where the live channel is truly programmed like a linear TV network. And the process is those rights have to be granted if we don't own the film or if the film doesn't have any copyright issues. And then it's a matter of, getting the owner to agree to give us streaming rights and ultimately allow us to put the film on the platform.
What does the streaming service of the Film Detective have coming up? I know you guys just debut an original series?
We just debuted an original series called Classic Films for Kids. And that's hosted by our friend, author Jennifer Churchill, who is the author of the book Movies Are Magic. So it's a series where she talks about films that would be maybe appreciated, but not necessarily have to be shown just to children. It can be shown to big kids like us too. But it's really a way to educate an audience about the history of cinema and fun anecdotal stories about the production and the film and film in general as a medium. Because so often the younger generation doesn't appreciate kind of where all this sort of, led to with digital and TikTok and YouTube and all that. Mm-hmm. So we get into that in the series, but it's done in a very non-academic way. It's sort of, it's fun for all ages. But that will be a reoccurring series, and it's on our network on Saturday mornings at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and then it will also be on our app as well.
You've already mentioned mentioned one release that you have in your June releases. What else can we expect from the Film Detective coming up?
Well, we have a lot of releases that we have planned outside of the Brain from Planet Arose. We are working on a new one right now that is not 100% ready, but we are working on an early collection of Tarzan. And if, of course, everyone remembers, Johnny Weissmuller, who was probably one of the most famous Tarzans on the screen. But The Adventures of Tarzan is a serial, and we're going to be putting that onto Blu-ray, and we're also going to be including some very early versions of the 1921 Adventures of Tarzan as a truncated feature starring Elmo Lincoln. Now, he's definitely a lesser known Tarzan, but we're happy to actually have Sam Sherman, who supplied us the material to the film, and he's also going to be doing some audio commentary to educate people about the history of that particular film, and also just in general, kind of the Tarzan films that came from that era. So we'll be putting that out in sometime, I think, in either August or September, depending on how quickly we get the final restoration done.
Okay.
And then later in the year, we're working on, we haven't announced this, so this might be you're hearing it first, but we're putting out the Vincent Price film, The Bat, as a re-release. We had put it out previously, but we're doing kind of a deluxe edition, and that's coming out this fall. And we're really excited about that. That's the 1959 film, The Bat, that has Vincent Price. And that will be done in a sort of a same presentation where we include a lot of bonus features. It has Agnes Moorehead in it as well. And if you haven't seen it already, it's a fun sort of like crime mystery whodunit film.
Okay, excellent. Yeah, the Tarzan release sounds really exciting. I know when I dug into the Sherlock Holmes release you guys did over the holidays, one of the things I loved about that, because I mean everybody's familiar with obviously Basil Rathbone, with Robert Downey Jr., some of the more recent ones, but to be able to see silent versions of the character and just different versions of the character that we weren't necessarily used to, all within one space of that entire box, that was really kind of exciting for me to dig into. It really made me interested in digging more into the screen history of Sherlock Holmes. So I definitely, and that's one of the things I really love about film detective releases in general, is because you do provide that context for when the films were made, what place they have in the larger history of the genre, whether it's film noir, science fiction, or even drama and musical. And it's just really always, I know I'm always excited when a new one crosses my path, because of the fact that it's just been, not only has it been interesting to see some of these films that otherwise I may not have necessarily seen or will have really had to dig to find, but just to learn a bit more about film history. And that's one of the things I've really appreciated about the releases over the past few months as I've been getting into them.
Oh, thank you. That means a lot to me. It's you're right. I mean, I grew up watching the Rathbone Sherlock Holmes films, and I love them. You know, when they aired those on television, those were some of my favorite older films to watch as a kid. But again, as you find out, you know, later in life, you start kind of delving further into the history of those films and realize that there were other actors, right? So in the case of Arthur Watner, I had never really seen many of those until I started getting some of these collector's prints from my friend Sam Sherman. And we were really depressed at how little we knew about the material that survived, if any. And thankfully, you know, Sam, as a collector, he had some original 16 millimeter reduction prints, and we were able to improve the quality. While they're not perfect, as they would be if they were from the original 35 millimeter elements, they look, you know, hands down better than anything I'd ever seen previously. So it's great that you appreciate that, because we did put a lot of work into the Sherlock Holmes Vault collection, and we try to include, you know, as many early curios that we could get our hands on to show that there's other stuff out there that is very rare. And thankfully, between collectors and the Library of Congress, we were able to, you know, have a boatload of additional special features on that. And in some cases, I think some of the ones we included have never been released previously. So thanks for your kind words.
Mm-hmm. And thank you very much for your time today. It was really great to get to know you as far as your history as a film archivist, film collector, and how you got involved with doing this great service. I think to film collectors in general, and being able to help preserve these films for older generations to discover them.
We hope that new generations do discover them, because this is the whole goal, is to have a younger audience appreciate older cinema and have an affection for it, because that's the only way these movies stay relevant. And it's one thing to have preservation, but unless you have interested people wanting to watch them, they just sit in the vault.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, indeed, and I think that's the biggest shame. And is there, before we wrap up here, is there something that you might some piece of advice for up and coming cinephiles that you can give with regards to approaching older films, or films they may not have heard about for the first time?
Don't be afraid of black and white films. I think that a lot of these executives at these big companies, they try to marginalize black and white film, and they make this assumption that a younger audience isn't going to have the attention span to watch an older film. And I don't think that the people that are kind of in positions of power give a younger audience enough credit for what they will like and what they might appreciate. So I think that don't rely on the sort of the big companies for your education. Go into the world of cinema with an open mind, because all of the films that are made today have their origin as far as what they were influenced by from the beginning of cinema. If you look at everything from like even Star Wars, right, from the beginning graphics where they have the scrolling graphics, that was done on Flash Gordon Conquers the Universe, right? So the more you kind of open your self up to watching older films, then you'll have an appreciation for kind of how we arrived to today with special effects and everything from stop motion animation, how that's done. And CGI certainly is great, but Ray Harryhausen did amazing stuff, right, without that sort of technical wizardry that we have on a computer.
Mm-hmm. No, indeed, and yeah, I know it's funny because of the fact that, I mean, obviously, I watch so much of modern films that it's good to it's good to find a one of these smaller discoveries like the ones that you guys have been putting out at Film Detective, and just really, again, it basically boils down to seeing something that I may not have necessarily seen before. I mean, I know I think one of my favorite discoveries from Film Detective has been A Life at Stake, which is another one of those films that really shows you Angela Lansbury before she was best known for Murder, She Wrote, in that same type of femme fatale, hard-nosed character that you saw in something like The Manchurian Candidate, which can be quite a shock.
Absolutely. And again, a film that is actually plays really well, production, excellent music score by the famous Les Baxter. So there are elements to A Life at Stake that make that, not just a great film noir movie, but just a great movie in general, and an appreciation for her character in that film. I think that if you're a fan of Angela Lansbury, or anyone that likes film noir, that's a perfect example of a lesser known film that we did kind of throw the entire kitchen sink at with restoration, and treated it like it was like an A-level release, because I just felt that the film itself warranted that. And I'm so glad that you appreciate that. It's great talking to someone that actually appreciates the effort that we put into these releases. So thank you, Brian.
Oh, no problem. And before we wrap up, where can people find the Film Detective?
So the Film Detective, as a streaming service, they can go to thefilmdetective.com, and if they go to that website, you can sign up. It's $3.99 per month. We also have our streaming service on several other places as a live channel. It's on Sling TV. It's on Plex TV as a streaming 24/7 program network. And then, of course, our Blu-rays that we put out every month. You can buy those at various e-tailers online. And our website links to those stores as well. So I would say, thefilmdetective.com. Take a look. We have all sorts of announcements. We also have our podcast, as well as the Fandor company that is our sister company, where we do a lot of stuff with independent film, and a lot of the Film Detective titles do reside on Fandor as well. So we're the alternative to the mainstream, and certainly if you love classic cinema or independent film or genre film, we definitely will be appreciated by the fans of all those types of categories.
I could not agree more with that. And Phil, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Brian. Appreciate your support.
I'd like to thank Phil for joining me today. It's great to hear a perspective on film from a collector's standpoint, and it was really great to get to know him in terms of his history with film preservation and film collecting in general. I think that's something that I think it was a discussion that we can certainly, even somebody like me who's who's been a collector, can certainly appreciate what goes into something like the Film Detective. That's going to do it for this episode of the Sonic Cinema podcast. I hope you check us out again at wherever you listen to podcasts, at patreon.com/Sonic Cinema or www.sonic-cinema.com. There's going to be more coming up, including some more established classics, and we're going to be discussing some more film soundtracks. And I hope you join us for that conversation. Thank you very much.